White judge finds black woman only to learn she's a co-author on his book. Part. The rain fell steadily outside the courthouse windows as Judge William Frost adjusted his glasses. His courtroom was nearly empty on this dreary Tuesday morning. He glanced at the clock, 9:05 a.m., then down at the case file before him. The woman standing at the defendant's table wore a simple navy blue dress. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and despite the early hour, she looked perfectly put together. William noted her calm posture and the quiet confidence in her eyes. Dr. Eleanor Bennett, you stand before this court with 7 parking violations at Memorial Hospital, totaling $1,750 in fines. How do you plead? William's voice carried the weight of 20 years on the bench. Eleanor's voice was clear and steady. I acknowledge the violations, Your Honor. William nodded. He had heard every excuse in the book over his career. People rarely took responsibility for their actions anymore. However, Eleanor continued, I would like to explain the circumstances. William sighed inwardly but gestured for her to proceed. He prided himself on running an efficient courtroom, and explanations typically slowed things down. During those 2 weeks, I was the lead surgeon for victims of the train derailment. We had 17 critical patients, and I performed back-to-back surgeries for sometimes 14 hours straight. I simply couldn't leave to move my car during the posted hours. William's expression remained neutral. While I appreciate your service to the community, Dr. Bennett, the law applies equally to everyone. The hospital has designated areas for staff during emergencies. Those spots were full, Your Honor. The entire medical staff was called in. William tapped his pen against the bench. I understand, but rules exist for a reason. Emergency vehicles needed clear access. Your fine stands at $1,750, due within 30 days. Eleanor nodded respectfully. I understand, Your Honor. As she gathered her papers, she reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. William watched as she walked forward and placed it on his bench. Perhaps we should discuss our publishing deadline over coffee sometime, Judge Frost. Cambridge Press called yesterday about our final draft. William felt a strange sensation in his stomach. There was something familiar about her voice now that he thought about it, but surely it couldn't be. Good day, Your Honor, Eleanor said, turning away with dignity. William stared at the business card. Dr. Eleanor Bennett, head of trauma surgery, Memorial Hospital. Below that, in smaller print, contributing author, Justice and Medicine, Ethical Frontiers. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up the card. For the past 18 months, William had been working on a book about the intersection of law and medicine. His publisher had paired him with a brilliant medical ethicist whose insights had transformed his thinking, someone he'd never met in person, communicating only through emails and occasional phone calls. As the next case was called, William slipped the card into his pocket, his mind suddenly elsewhere. The courtroom seemed unusually warm, and for the first time in years he felt unsettled on the bench. That evening, as rain continued to pour outside his window, William opened a package that had arrived from Cambridge Press. Inside was the preliminary cover design for his book, the culmination of his life's work combining legal theory and medical ethics. There, printed below his own name, was hers, Dr. Eleanor Bennett. William sat heavily in his chair, the weight of the morning's interaction settling on him like a physical presence. For nearly 2 years, he had admired the brilliant mind behind those thoughtful emails and challenging questions, never once connecting it to the calm, dignified woman he had found that morning without a second thought. Part 2. William stared at the book cover for a long time. The lamp in his study cast a soft glow over the words, Justice and Medicine, Ethical Frontiers, by Hon. William Frost and Dr. Eleanor Bennett. His fingers traced the raised letters of her name. For 18 months, they had exchanged hundreds of emails about complex ethical cases. They had debated patient rights versus public safety, the limits of medical intervention, and the role of compassion in judgment. He had grown to respect her sharp mind and thoughtful perspective, all without knowing who she truly was. William opened his laptop and found their most recent email thread. He had always imagined Dr. Bennett as an older, perhaps retired physician, with graying hair and reading glasses, someone who resembled his former professors at Oxford. Never once had he pictured the composed, dignified woman who had stood before him in court that morning. "What must she think of me?" he whispered to the empty room. He reached for the business card she had left. After turning it over in his hand several times, he picked up his phone and dialed the number. "Hello?" Her voice was exactly as it had. "Been in court, clear, confident, professional. Dr. Bennett, this is William Frost." His voice felt rough in his throat. "Judge Frost, I've been expecting your call." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken words. "I received the cover design today," he finally said. "Yes, I got mine too. Cambridge did a lovely job with it." William took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology. For the fine or for not recognizing your co-author?" There was no anger in her voice, just a simple question. "Both, I suppose." William ran a hand through his hair. "I'd like to meet properly, if you're willing, to discuss the book and other things. The Bean Cafe tomorrow at 4? I have a surgery in the morning but should be finished by then. I'll be there." After hanging up, William pulled out the manuscript they had been refining for the past 6 months. He began reading it again, but with new eyes. Paragraphs he had written about the cold logic of law suddenly seemed hollow. Sections she had written about the human cost of rigid rules now felt personal. The next day, William arrived early at the Bean Cafe. He chose a quiet corner table and ordered 2 coffees, one black, one with cream and one sugar, exactly as she had mentioned liking in an email months ago. When Eleanor walked in, several heads turned. She moved with natural grace, her lab coat replaced by a simple blouse and trousers. William stood as she approached, suddenly feeling like a nervous student rather than a respected judge. "You remembered how I take my coffee," she said, noticing. "The waiting cup." Chapter 4, page 12 of our emails. "You mentioned it when discussing the late-night drafting sessions." William offered a small smile. Eleanor sat down across from him, placing a copy of their manuscript on the table between them. "It's strange, isn't it? To know someone so well in one context and then discover you didn't know them at all in another." William nodded. "In my courtroom, I saw only a case number and a violation. I failed to see the person behind it." "And what about in our emails? Who did you think I was?" William hesitated, then admitted, "I pictured someone older. Perhaps retired, certainly not a black woman surgeon." Eleanor finished for him, her expression neutral. William felt his face grow warm. "I never considered it at all. And that's the problem, isn't it?" Eleanor took a sip of her coffee. "Our book argues that justice requires seeing the whole person, not just the facts of the case. Interesting that we're now living our own case study." She opened the manuscript to a section they had debated extensively. "You wrote this part about how the law must remain blind to maintain fairness. I wonder if you still believe that." William looked at the paragraph he had written months ago. The words now felt hollow, theoretical, divorced from the reality of human experience. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "I need to reconsider what it means to see clearly." Part 3. The afternoon sun streamed through the cafe windows as William and Eleanor sat with their manuscript between them. 2 empty coffee cups and a plate of half-eaten biscuits showed they had been talking for some time. "Tell me about that week," William said quietly. "The train derailment. What was it really like?" Eleanor's eyes grew distant. "Monday morning, 5 a.m., my phone rang with the emergency alert. 47 injured, 17 critical. I drove to the hospital in my pajamas with a coat thrown over them." William listened intently as she continued. "By the time I parked, ambulances were already arriving. I ran to the emergency room and didn't step outside again for 30 hours. We lost 3 patients that first day, despite everything we tried." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but her hands tightened around her cup. "The next 4 days were a blur. Sleep when possible, usually on a cot in the break room. The parking ticket started on day 2, but there was no time to move my car, no time to eat properly, No time to call my mother to tell her I was okay. William felt something twist in his chest. And then you came to my courtroom, weeks later. And there you were, seeing only the violations, not the circumstances behind them. Eleanor's eyes met his. Just like in our early manuscript drafts, where you argued that context doesn't matter in applying the law. William frowned, remembering their heated email debates. I've always believed in the consistent application of rules. It's the foundation of a just society. Is it just to fine someone for saving lives? Eleanor asked, not with anger but genuine curiosity. The law can't make exceptions based on good intentions, William replied, falling back on his familiar argument. Once we start deciding who deserves exceptions, we open the door to favoritism and bias. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. That sounds exactly like what you wrote in Chapter 3. But here's what I wonder, William. If the law can't bend for human circumstances, is it truly serving human needs? She pulled out a newspaper clipping from her bag and placed it on the table. It showed the aftermath of the train derailment. Twisted, metal, emergency workers, and in the corner, a blurry figure in surgical scrubs rushing between ambulances. That's me, she said simply, pointing to the figure. What you see as a parking violation, I see as the day I held a 16-year-old boy's hand while we waited to see if we could save his leg. William stared at the photograph, seeing for the first time the human story behind the case file. In 18 years on the bench, how many other stories had he missed? I think, Eleanor said gently, this is why our book matters, because without both perspectives, law and medicine, rules and compassion, neither of us sees the complete picture. William looked up from the photograph. In our emails, you once wrote that good medicine requires seeing patterns while never forgetting the individual patient. Perhaps good law requires the same balance. Eleanor smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her. Now that sounds like something we should add to Chapter 3. As the cafe began to fill with the evening crowd, they bent their heads over the manuscript, marking passages that needed revision. For the first time in their collaboration, William found himself questioning his most basic assumptions about justice. This fine, he said suddenly. Your parking tickets, I'd like to keep it, Eleanor interrupted. Consider it my contribution to our research. William looked surprised. You're not angry about it? I was at first, she admitted, but now I see it as the perfect example for our book. Sometimes, William, the most important lessons come at a personal cost. Part 4. Over the next few weeks, William and Eleanor met regularly to finish their book. Today they sat in the hospital cafeteria, surrounded by doctors and nurses hurrying through their lunch breaks. The busy atmosphere was a stark contrast to the quiet courtroom William was used to. I've never eaten here before, William admitted, looking around at the medical staff in their colorful scrubs. It's quite lively. Eleanor smiled. This is real life, William. Messy, rushed, and full of people trying their best under pressure. A young doctor waved at Eleanor as she passed. Dr. Bennett, that technique you showed me worked perfectly. Mrs. Wilson is recovering well. Wonderful news, Dr. Parker. I'll stop by later to check on her. William watched the exchange with interest. Your colleagues respect you greatly. We're a team here, Eleanor explained. No one person can do everything. We rely on each other, especially during emergencies. William nodded thoughtfully. In court, it's different. The judge stands alone. Sometimes I wonder if that isolation affects our perspective. Perhaps that's why our book is important, Eleanor suggested. It bridges those separate worlds. They turned their attention to the manuscript. Chapter 5 needed work, the section on how medical emergencies should be handled in legal contexts. I've been thinking about what you said, William began. About seeing the whole picture. I've reviewed some of my past rulings with that lens. Eleanor looked up, curious. And? I found cases where I applied the law correctly but missed the human element completely. William's voice was quiet. A single mother fined for driving without insurance when she was rushing her asthmatic child to hospital. A homeless man penalized for sleeping in the park when the shelter was full. What would you do differently now? Eleanor asked, William considered the question carefully. The law gives judges discretion for a reason. I've rarely used that power. I believed consistency was paramount. And now I wonder if true justice requires both consistency and compassion. He tapped the manuscript. That's what we should emphasize in Chapter 5. Eleanor nodded in agreement. In medicine, we have protocols for everything, but every patient is unique. The best doctors know when to follow the rules strictly and when to adapt. They worked through lunch, revising paragraphs and adding new insights. The collaboration that had once existed only in emails was now enriched by their in-person discussions. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor's pager beeped urgently. She checked it and her expression changed immediately. "Emergency?" William asked. "Major car accident on the highway. Multiple casualties coming in." She gathered her things quickly. "I have to go." "Of course," William said. "We can finish this later." Eleanor hesitated. "Would you like to observe? It might add perspective to our chapter on emergency decision-making." William was surprised by the offer. "I wouldn't be in the way." "Stay in the observation area. You'll see everything without interfering." For the next 3 hours, William watched Eleanor and her team work. The emergency room was controlled chaos. Doctors calling out vital signs, nurses moving with practiced efficiency, decisions made in seconds that could mean life or death. He saw Eleanor perform procedures with steady hands despite the pressure. He watched her comfort a frightened young woman while also directing her team. He observed as she made difficult choices about who to treat first when multiple patients needed immediate care. By the time the emergency was handled, William had filled several pages of his notebook. But more importantly, he had gained a new understanding of what Eleanor had tried to explain about context and circumstances. When Eleanor finally stepped out of surgery, exhausted but satisfied that all patients were stable, she found William waiting. "Thank you," he said simply. "I think I finally understand." Part 5. 6 months later, William stood at a podium in the university auditorium. The room was packed with people. Doctors in white coats, lawyers in suits, students with notebooks, and members of the public who had read about the book in the newspaper. Justice in Medicine, Ethical Frontiers had become unexpected bestseller. What had started as an academic text had found a wider audience, touching people beyond their professional circles. William adjusted his glasses and looked out at the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight. Before we begin the formal presentation, I'd like to share a personal story." The audience quieted as William continued. "Last year, I fined a doctor for parking violations at Memorial Hospital. It was a straightforward case in my courtroom. 7 tickets, clear evidence, no legal defense. I applied the laws I always had with consistency and detachment." He paused, his eyes finding Eleanor in the front row. "What I didn't know was that this doctor had worked 30-hour shifts saving victims of the train derailment. What I didn't know was that she was also the brilliant co-author I had been corresponding with for over a year." A murmur ran through the audience. "Dr. Eleanor Bennett taught me the most important lesson of my career, that true justice requires seeing the whole person, not just the facts of a case." William gestured to Eleanor. "Would you join me, please?" Eleanor made her way to the stage, amid warm applause. As she took her place beside William, he stepped back respectfully. "Our book argues that both medicine and law must balance rules with humanity," Eleanor began. "As a surgeon, I follow strict protocols, but I never forget that each patient has their own story. Judge Frost has learned that while the law must be consistent, it must also be compassionate." William nodded in agreement. "The fine I issued. Dr. Bennett stands as a reminder of what happens when we apply rules without context. It represents the old way of thinking that our book challenges." A young law student raised her hand during the question period. "Has working together changed how you approach your jobs?" William and Eleanor exchanged glances. "I've established a medical consultation panel for cases involving health emergencies," William explained. "And I now ask more questions before making judgments. And I've invited Judge Frost to speak to our medical residents about legal considerations in emergency situations," Eleanor added. We've found that both our professions benefit from this exchange. After the presentation, as people lined up to have their books signed, William noticed a familiar face, the court clerk who had processed Eleanor's case. "Your Honor," the clerk said quietly, "I've been thinking about the changes you've made in court recently. The way you take time to hear people's stories now. It makes a difference." William smiled. "Sometimes the most important lessons come from unexpected places, Robert." Later that evening, William and Eleanor shared a quiet dinner at a small restaurant near the hospital. "I received a letter today," Eleanor said, pulling an envelope from her bag. "Cambridge Press wants us to write a second book, this time about our experience working together." William considered this. From courtroom adversaries to co-authors, it would make quite a story. "More than that," Eleanor replied. "It's about what happens when two different worlds truly see each other, when justice meets compassion." William raised his glass in a toast. "To seeing clearly." Eleanor smiled and touched her glass to his. "To seeing clearly and to what comes next."